Hey everybody, and welcome to the Gwinnett Church YouTube page. My name is Lauren Espy, and today we're beginning part one of a two-part series called How to Talk to Your Kids About Race. This is going to be an incredible conversation, one that we hope enters into your homes and into your family as well. So thanks for joining us for part one of How to Talk to Your Kids About Race. I'm joined by my friend Rebecca, who is a seasoned mom of three kiddos, her youngest being 18 years old. So she knows what she's doing, people, which is great. Rebecca's joining us. Rebecca recently spoke to our Gwinnett Church staff and just really helped us as it related to the framework of raising kids in this generation, and especially as you talk about race and how we really dive into this conversation. So Rebecca, I'm so thrilled to have you on this call today. And then I'm also joined by my friend Renee. Renee and I have been friends for many years. In fact, our oldest sons are in an upstreet small group together, and we've become moms together in the same season of life. And really, we're getting to steward this conversation about race in America and parenting in a really interesting season. And I believe a really special season that God is calling us to be able to steward this message with our children and help navigate that with them. And so Renee and I have spent several breakfasts and lunches at Sugar Hill Diner just down the road talking about this. And so we're just going to dive into this conversation as three moms who love our kids fiercely and who want to do it well. And so I'm going to be speaking, obviously, from the only perspective I know, and asking questions. The goal of this is not for me to lead anything, but really to represent for many, maybe, of us white moms out there to say, how do we even dive into this? And so I want to start today by asking the question, and it's a question that I hear a lot of people say of like, how do I talk to my kids about race? And Renee, I know you and I over breakfast have talked about this. It's more than having a conversation with your kids. And I would love for you to share with those watching, where do we really begin on this? And maybe even a better question to what I just asked is, it's not about a conversation, it's larger than that. So can you tell us about your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Lauren. So as Lauren said, I believe that a conversation is great, and actually a dialogue where the conversation doesn't stop. It's a continuous dialogue throughout their years as they grow. But more important than a conversation is, how do we as moms model anti-racist behavior? How do we show our children how to do that? So it's one thing to have the conversations and to speak with them, but they're taking their cues from us and how we live our lives, the people who we surround ourselves with. So if they don't see that in our lives, then that's really what they're going to model as they grow into adulthood. So, I always think of just asking yourself the question, who are my closest friends? Mm-hmm. Who was my best friend when I was 13, when I was 30, when I was 40? Who are those people around me? And who are my children's friends? And I believe that the closer you are to people that are different, the more you begin to understand their stories, and the more that, you'll have more empathy towards what a different perspective and a different outlook on life is.
I love that, Renee. And I feel like for me, diving into those conversations, and again, by no means am I just like the model of anything over here, but I'm saying one of the things that has been hard is the conversations become uncomfortable, right? And, Rebecca, I would love for you to speak to this, because you really spoke to this for our staff of like how we lean into that. Because if we're going to ultimately, like you said, Renee, have empathy from these conversations, it's going to become, we have to deal with the uncomfortableness that happens in that. And Rebecca, I just feel like you've done this so well, as have you, Renee. But I mean, Rebecca, I would love for you to speak to that and maybe some of your experience wading into that world.
So one of the things that I would say is that is really not the conversation, just like Renee said. The thing about it is it's about how you live, right? So if certain situations come up, and this is the key piece to this, I believe, is that how you interact with your child when they show up a little bit differently than you might want for them, how they receive that acceptance of being their own individual personality and their individual choices. If it's not okay for them to deviate from what everyone else is doing, then they begin to live through that lens that people don't have the freedom to live, quote unquote, differently or individually, or to have a different perspective and it be okay. For example, if you're a family who believes that a certain type of college is the only option and anything else other than that may not be good enough, right? And so you might think, well, what's the big deal? Like, why would they associate that with race?
Yeah.
But see, it's more about tolerance and it's about acceptance and understanding that if your child, see, I'm a tech girl, I'm gonna go ahead and put that out there, right? Everybody wants to know about Georgia Tech, right? Okay.
Everyone wants to know.
You know, right? I mean, we even had, some coaches from Georgia say, is it okay if I talk to your child because you went to Tech? Well, I mean, my kids have the option not to do what we did. In fact, we have not been able to get a kid to want to go to Tech yet. I mean, there's that. But anyway, I digress, right? But I say that in jest because that is where tolerance begins. That if they don't have tolerance in their own home, in their own life about things that seem so simple, that everybody were basketball players, and then we get a kid who's a volleyball player. In the beginning, we were like, what are we doing? Like, what are we doing? But the reality of it is that she had her own path and it was a beautiful path, but it was one that was unfamiliar. And that's what's uncomfortable. It wasn't the fact that she wanted to do something different. It was the fact that is that really a sport? I mean, I know that's the wrong way to look at it, but in the beginning, because we had no knowledge, we began to attach these negative connotations to the idea of a sport that was simply different.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
And then it goes on to the student where everyone may be an athlete and this child may like music. And so now they're trying to navigate music when everybody else likes something else. I mean, and the list goes on. So the tolerance is about just them being individuals and showing up. So now when a person of a different race or culture or belief system shows up, it's natural to embrace it because that's what we do. We all are different and it's okay. It's acceptable. So that's why it would not be an overt conversation about race. It would be about if you hear some type of negativity of your child speaking of someone who has of a different culture or a different race, then that's where the conversation comes. Well, why do you think that? Or why would you say that? Or what did he say? Isn't he a nice, child? Or isn't she nice? Or those are the qualities you begin to level the field for your child.
And if
not overtly race. Yes.
Sorry. I love what you're saying. And as a parent of littles, I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, both sons. I think that it's never too early to do that. You might think I'm crazy, but I have taught my sons already the value of civil discourse and being able to respect each other's differences. One of my children believes in Santa. I won't say which one. And the other one does not believe in Santa. And so that was their first experience with believing different things, but me still telling them, okay, first let's talk about what is it that causes you to believe in Santa? What is it that causes you to not? And those are both true for you. And guess what? That's okay because those are your experiences and they're true for you. And we still love each other. You're still brothers in spite of that. And so now they have that in their back pocket of, hey, well, my friend believes this way and it's okay for him to believe that. I can still be friends with him because we all think differently. And I think the earlier that you start fostering that, to your point, Rebecca, it's going to enter into those more adult conversations. It's going to enter into those more difficult conversations about race, about, sexuality, any of that. I mean, you become, like you said, more tolerant and it becomes a part of your DNA. It's just ingrained in you to think that way. So I 100% agree with that.
That's amazing. Thank you all so much for sharing that. I mean, that in and of itself is a great way as a parent to be reminded that it really does begin with that understanding that we are all different in so many ways and celebrating that. I think that is so huge. Now, one of the things you both hit on though in that was the ability for people to have empathy, right? And and the need for that. And, I know for me, empathy has come through conversations, but it also has come, like you guys have spoken about, with self-awareness, and some of that self-awareness has been educating myself. Some of it has been, what's it like, as Jeff always says, what's it like on the other side of me, and realizing that. And so I would love for you both to share with us some areas of awareness that you have to have as as mothers raising sons and daughters, of color in America, what is some awareness that you have to have that maybe I don't? Because I think in growing my awareness of what you have to navigate, it helps me to be more aware and ultimately more empathetic and understanding. So I would love for you guys to share, maybe an example of something for those of us out there.
Well, I have a son. I'll start with him because I think that's probably the most significant thing that's happened with him. When he was in middle school, there was a situation where over time he began to demonstrate some ideas that he wasn't okay. Like he would ask, like, because I was an educator as well, so there was that. So he came home asking about why isn't it okay that I ask questions in math. I'm like, what do you mean you can't ask questions in math? Well, there would just be a joke about whether his mom's a math teacher, he should know certain things, but he's always been a really bright kid, and so I knew his questions were completely separate from intellect or what have you. It was just he wanting to know more. So then the comments began to be, well, maybe when you have more time after football practice, you'll be able to do this. Or even James got this grade. And it was like, it became this whole idea that there was something not okay with him. And the point of that is that he was a kid who always loved school. He's always happy. But with each day, he became a little bit, his shoulders started to drop, and he's a big kid. He was, at 11 years old, he's 5'8", right? And so basically the long story short was I realized that there was I called it bias at the time. And I said, there's some bias. I won't call what it is. I just know there's bias, and we want to look at this. And so I had support from the administration and what have you. And, basically, it got to a point where it wasn't okay for him to be on the team anymore. And I asked that he be removed from the entire team and changed in the middle of the school year. And so when he came back in January on the new team, in one day, my son was back. He came home happy. He was standing tall again. He was excited. So when we talk about awareness, we all have challenges with our kids, whether in different situations. We can all say, oh, that was a bad year, or the teacher team maybe wasn't a match. We all have that. But sometimes as a mom with a child who's African-American, particularly a male, that sometimes is layered in a different way because it becomes about them as a person, and they don't understand it because he begged me not to change his team. He begged me not to change it. And I just said, sometimes parents have to make decisions that kids just don't get a vote on. And this is one of those times, and we're going to change it. But then after it was done, he was happy. So I think the point of it is I had to look at everything by its merit. And even though race used to be like the last thing I would look at, in the back of my mind, I knew it could be first, but I didn't want to ever admit that I have to start there. So I have to rule out all these 8 things or whatever it was before I could admit, yeah, this is a racial issue and we're going to have to deal with it.
Wow.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
It breaks your heart because you don't want to think that could be. But the bottom line though, and I've learned, is that the people who carry some of that is not intentional. They're just living out the perspective that they've known that's never been challenged. Yet, why would you bring up football about whether he could do or not do? Like that, those two don't seem like they're connected really, right? And so that's how I began to see that.
Okay, so I have a question in that, Rebecca, because I think it's gracious of you to say that, people may not be aware, and maybe that is a blind spot, but when you become aware of a bias you have, of a piece of racism in your own heart, or, I think a lot of people are discovering and becoming self-aware right now of some things. How do you own that well? How as a white woman would I own that well? I mean, what does it mean to hear I'm sorry, or I didn't realize that? I mean, what would be the words you would have wished you would have heard regarding your son? And I know you weren't asking for that, but I just think part of the mending and forgiving process in this is for those of us who have things in our hearts that have come out of our mouths. I mean, we know this scripture speaks to this, right? Out of the heart, the mouth speaks, right? And so what would you have wished you have heard, or what can we do as we go forward in these conversations?
For me, because of my style and the approach that I have to people, I would probably find something that would be equally as offensive to you as would be to me. So when you mentioned the sport or whatever and why my son can or cannot do, or giving him this undue belief about his performance, I might say something like, how would you feel if someone assumed that when you showed up with blonde hair, that they would assume that you must be dizzy, quote unquote dizzy, because that's a stereotype, right? And we know it's not true. How would you feel if somebody dismissed what you thought or your intellect based on the color of your hair?
Right.
You would be like, how dare you, right? Because you know what you possess intellectually, experiences, how hard you work, what kind of person you are. That's deciding who you are based on one physical attribute of yourself.
Yeah.
And it's no different when we as African Americans show up and somebody decides that there must be something less about you simply because you fit into that cultural ethnicity. Then I think that's how you begin to connect. Is it okay with you that I decide what your intellect is because of the color of your hair? And if it's not okay with you, it's no more okay that you decide what a student's ability academically is because he's an African American male. It's the same.
That's good. That's good. Renee, what would you say?
I definitely agree with Rebecca. I'm raising two boys and that are African American. And actually, when I found out I was pregnant with my second son, I experienced a lot of depression and fear because at the time it was 2016. When I had my first son, it was 2014. That's when Ferguson happened. Not too long after Trayvon Martin happened in 2012. And so all I could see was the fact that I'm bringing two more little brown boys into this country, into this world, that I'm going to have to explain to them why just by the way that you're dressed or just because you're driving in a vehicle that someone thinks you shouldn't be driving or because you're in a neighborhood where someone doesn't think you belong, that you can be profiled and your life could be at stake. Even if you do everything the way that you should, that could happen. That people may see you as a threat simply because you're in Black skin. And as a mom of littles right now, my question is, when is it that my two boys are going to go from being cute to being a threat? When is that going to happen? When they're 10? When they're 12? I don't know. And those are the fears that I have in my mind. And those are the conversations that I have yet to have with them because they're 3 and 6, but I know they're coming. And so I'm trying to do all that I can to help prime them for that. I grew up in a house with all girls, so we didn't have those types of conversations, but I did have conversations surrounding my hair and how I could wear it, how I needed to come out of the house and be presentable at all times, because I was judged at harsher than my white friends were. And I always needed to be clean. I always needed to make sure that I was well behaved. I couldn't act out. And it's just challenging because you go from being able to feel free as a child to this mold that if you want to excel, if you want to do well, if you want to be someone important, that you have to fit into this mold. And so those were some of the narratives that I grew up hearing. And now, I've got my boys, and unfortunately, I will have to have those conversations because I don't want them to be in a situation later on in life and not be prepared. I would rather them come home alive than, have them not be prepared and, tragedy happens. So yeah, it's definitely an unfair thing. And those are the conversations that I ultimately will have to have with them.
I think that as a white mom, it's so sad to me that that is even a conversation that you are thinking about having in the midst of you and I both raising 6-year-olds in this world. And, what is first grade going to be like? I mean, those are the things. And yet you have this other narrative that also is playing in your mind. And I just, as a friend, I mean, you and I have said this without being on a Zoom call together. It's just, I hate that. I absolutely hate it. And it feels so grossly unfair. And I just, before we even move forward, I just want to recognize that feels so unfair. And I hate that, Renee. Rebecca, I do have a question around Renee's conversation because you've navigated this, right? You have an 18-year-old son.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that for us? I mean, can you tell us what that process has been like for you?
Well, one of the things that I think that I've been very fortunate in that my sister, there's 6 of us and I'm the youngest. And so my oldest sister is almost 17 years older than me.
Okay.
And so when I was a young mom, she said, and when I first had my son, she said, I just need you to think about our dad and your husband. My dad was 6'5" and my husband is 7 feet. And somehow they have managed to navigate life in America, even though their racism exists. And what that did for me was it liberated me from the constant fear. She said that our dad was a strong Black man. In fact, he was born in 1917. So he would have been over 100 years old if he were living today. But that tells you about what life was like over his lifetime, right? And so while he had a 6th grade education, but yet he managed to have a family and he worked hard and we owned homes and cars and all of that because he worked hard. And my husband is the same way. And so he even recently said, do not give him fear. He cannot walk in the world and be afraid. Yes, there are things that he has to be aware of. Yes, he has to make sure his hands are in, plain sight. But I don't want him afraid. And he is at times, right? He was stopped recently and the officer asked for his license. And he said, it's in the back of the passenger seat. And the officer said, well, will you get it? He said, I would much rather you get it, sir, because he did not want to move his hands.
Yeah.
And the officer said, just get it. It's okay. I promise it's okay. So Jay did it and it was fine. But my point is that there has to be a balance between the constant fear.
Yeah.
Because I think that the upset for that was more about being late for curfew than it was about being stopped. So that's what that issue was about for him. But the point is that, yes, it could go sideways. But the point of it is I want him to know that while we have seen all kinds of things happen and all those things are real,
right?
We just need you to show up and be the best guy you can be. And that's all that we can do. And I can't give him more than that because he can't be anything more than who he is.
Right.
And so that added burden of trying to be something else will not serve him in those situations. It just won't. And while I'm not in any way judging people who have the fear, because the fear is real, don't get me wrong. I am not saying that it isn't. But for me, I just know that I'll become paralyzed under the fear. And so at some level, I just have to let it go and just pray and hope for the best. That's all I have.
Yeah, I wanted to speak to the fear and choosing whether or not to let it paralyze you. And Lauren, I know we might get to this later, but I just wanted to share that, I had a decision when I was experiencing the fear when my children were younger, whether or not I was going to let it paralyze me or if I was going to leverage that fear to do something. And so that's why I started the 2 communities that I did, Coffee Moms and Friends of Coffee Moms. And through those groups, one of the initiatives that we've done is moms that are raising Black boys. We've entered into community with police officers. And I did that.
Wow, I love that. I love that. Sorry.
I did that. No, you're fine.
It's awesome.
I did that because I had an experience. I was a member of the 2019 class of Leadership Gwinnett, and I had an experience on a ride along with a Gwinnett County police officer. And when I went on that ride along, I asked the question, what is the hardest part about your job? And he said to me something that never will leave me. He said, I believe that because I'm an officer, I have a target on my back just because I'm an officer. And that makes it really difficult for me to do my job. And in that moment, I realized how much more connected the Black community is to law enforcement than we thought, because I say the exact same thing about my 2 Black boys and my Black husband, that because they're in Black skin, they have a target on their back. And so that, made me say, okay, I need to lean in more to this community. And
I love that.
God moved the way that he always does and put a couple in my husband and I's small group where the husband is an officer. Wow. And so through conversation and another nonprofit, we got brought together in a group that we co-lead of law enforcement officers and moms raising boys of color. And
I so love
beautiful, it. Beautiful. So, to your point about fear paralyzing you or not, like, I'm not going to diminish the fear. I'm going to acknowledge it because it's a part of who I am. It's my story. But I can use that. I can use that to, empower other mothers. I can use that to help my sons understand what law enforcement does. I mean, there's so many things, but I wasn't going to let that just hold me back.
Of course. I love it. I love that.
It's
Thank
amazing.
you for sharing that.
I know. And Renee, you were an example of getting uncomfortable. I mean, having a conversation, starting this group and saying, hey, we're going to navigate the waters of, police and Black moms raising. I mean, that's a lot to navigate. And you're saying, you took the time to do that. I mean, you could have just said, I'm not going to even dive into that because you're a very busy woman. I mean, let's just be honest. I mean, and yet you took the time to do it. And then you chose a conversation that wasn't going to be comfortable to make that happen. And I just feel like you've modeled for so many of us what it requires for us to be bridge builders in this season. Thanks for joining us for part 1 of how to talk to your kids about race. I really hope that this was a helpful time for you, and for many of us that this is a reminder that we get to steward these very conversations in our very own homes. So we look forward to being back with you next week as we begin part 2 of how to talk to your kids about race. Until then, have a great week.